Several weeks ago, I took the confirmation students to the Jewish temple in Des Moines, B'nai Jeshurun. And we had a great experience. It started off in our little tour with quite an incident, however. When our tour guide asked the children, what are the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, and they started saying Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. As a pastor, I didn't know whether to be extremely excited that they at least knew their Gospels, or a little bit disappointed that they had forgotten the first 5 books of the Old Testament. However, one of the things that I was reminded of as we gathered together at that time was that Shabbat starts at sundown. Right, in the book of Genesis, it said that God created day, and it starts at evening time. And so today, as we gather this morning for Christmas Eve, we're going to act as if Shabbat has not started quite yet, extending our Advent season just one more Sunday morning before we all gather back around this evening to celebrate Christ's birth. Listen to a reading from the book of Samuel. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all of her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival used to provoke her severely, to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. When her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall not drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently. Only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine. But Hannah answered, No, my Lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of great anxiety and vexation all this time. Then Eli answered, Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your sight. Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. They rose early in the morning, and they worshipped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house in Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. In due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I have asked him of the Lord. Thus ends the reading. This morning as we gather around, I entitled my sermon, Labor Pains. Right now, I have a sister who is due today and waiting to have her baby. And I can only hope that I actually will get the opportunity to go and be there with them as the baby comes into the world, maybe tomorrow afternoon. But let me tell you, my sister is a miserable human being right now. She is experiencing all of the nasty things that happen when you are 40 weeks pregnant and just wanting the baby to come. She had to work on Friday. She's a nurse. She works in the PACU, so she gets people ready for surgery and after surgery. And of course, Friday before Christmas is one of the busiest surgery days ever. And when I called her, she said, all of my coworkers are lazy. I feel like I'm doing all the work. I'm miserable. She told me the same story 3 times within a 10-minute phone conversation. She called it pregnant fog. I thought about this morning in relationship to what do you do on the Sunday morning before Christmas Eve, and how do you celebrate this opportunity? And all I could think about was poor Mary, being in labor pain, traveling to Bethlehem on a donkey, perhaps. And then I started to think about how, as a male, I will never experience labor pain. So, I did some research on labor pain. Can we see a video this morning?
And we would do the labor simulation machine.
I got something.
Yeah, wish me luck. I'm super nervous.
Don't be nervous.
I might throw up just because I'm super nervous. Okay, easy on the buttons there. Oh, shut up. Oh, I survived. I survived very well.
You survived the first contraction.
Okay.
Now I know where I need to be.
Wow. That came out of nowhere.
Here comes another one. Okay, here it comes.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's good for now.
This is fun.
Yeah, it's a blast.
Ready?
No, I'm not ready. Wait.
You have to breathe.
I can't.
Breathe through it. It helps.
Yeah. Is this how I sound when you're in labor? Because I honestly want to punch you in the face. Ah! Oh, this is legit. This sucks. It feels like my belly button is getting pulled through my body.
How's your butt feel?
My butt's fine.
Does it feel like the baby is mine your butt?
Is it supposed to? Because that sounds like the worst thing I've ever felt in my life.
Alright, well, then you're going to show. The back in your cup. Here you go.
I feel downstairs. My crappy. Oh, whoa. Oh, if I heard this count down by a new one, I promise. Where do I use your legs up? Oh, you know, they're not going to be easier. My leg just goes up. Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's when they get a nerd. Oh, actually, they have more treatment.
I'm so sorry. Now, every wife's going to see this video and tag their husbands.
Yep.
And I'm going to go like sell out because everyone's cousins will be like, why'd you do that, bro? And I'm like, my wife's tagging me in this post and challenged me to do this. Oh! It's just coming. Oh! Get every girl! Cut it off! Cut it off! Stop! Stop! Give me my baby. Give me my baby.
Yeah, we're done, because I don't work when they did the hospital.
Yeah, I don't want to die.
Yeah, no. Okay, good, buddy. You did it.
And this is when I started to wonder what Hannah was thinking by asking to have a child. I know, just watching that video, I am so glad that I never have to go through that experience. But I started to think about the different types of labor pains that we all may be experiencing during the Christmas season. That Advent is really about acknowledging our need to experience the living God in our hearts now, but also waiting for the renewal of spirit that happens through the Christmas season. And I was reminded of one of my favorite Christmas stories. And this morning, since it's kind of an unusual story, I'm going to put on my storyteller hat and share this story with you as we remember labor pains. The book is called The Modern Magi by Carol Lynn Pearson. And it starts a little something like this. There was a woman named Annabelle Perkins. She was 57 years old, and she waited tables 3 days a week at the restaurant her father had run and operated. Her mother and father had died within the last 5 years, and so she was quite lonely. She went to work, and she remembered all the fond memories of her father being around the restaurant. And she sat drinking her raspberry tea at the kitchen table, remembering two of the fondest memories she had of her parents. The first one, a pair of gloves. Actually, only one glove. This glove was supposedly worn by Teddy Roosevelt one day when he came into the diner. And after he left, her father had found the glove underneath the bench. He framed it in a picture and would tell everybody who came in the store, this was Teddy Roosevelt's glove. And he said that our black bean soup was one of the best he had ever had. Maybe we should start with that. The other present was a little bronze lamb. Now, this bronze lamb mournfully looked up as it laid its head on its right heel. She knew that it wasn't gold, but she remembers the story of her mom telling her, this indeed is a gold lamb. You see, when Jesus looks at us, he sees us just as perfect as he created us. So they called it the bronze but gold lamb. And every time they would play with the little bronze but gold lamb, Annabelle's mother would say, do you remember the story of Jesus? Knowing that she remembered the story, she would say, tell me again, tell me again. And time after time, her mom would remind her that this little lamb had been lost in the flock. When all the shepherds and sheep went to Bethlehem to see the Christ child, this lamb got lost. That's why this lamb was so special. One day, this lamb would be a gift to the baby Jesus. Annabelle sat drinking her tea at the table, thinking of the fond memories of her parents. When all of the sudden she decided, maybe this year, this lamb could be a gift to the Christ child. She bundled up her coat and began walking down the street to the local travel agency, where she walked into the door, now her heart beating ever quickly, almost out of breath. You see, Annabelle had had rheumatic fever as a child, and it left her with a heart murmur. She was growing older, and she knew her limits. But as she swung the door open, she was kindly greeted by Mr. Olson, who had made it seem like she was one of his best friends. She began to say that she was wanting to go to Bethlehem. He pulled out the first brochure with an entire 3-week tour of the Holy Land. She asked how much, and he said $3,800. And she said, oh no, I don't need the whole Holy Land. He pulled out another brochure, 2 weeks, a tour around Egypt and Bethlehem, Jerusalem. And she said, how much? And he said, about 3,000. Too much, she said. Something shorter. Are you crunched for time? She responded saying, of course I'm crunched for time, knowing that she didn't want to admit that she didn't have the resources to fund a trip that long. He pulled out a last brochure, 5 days in Bethlehem, an adventure at Christmas time. How much, she said? 2,000. Oh my gosh, she said, perfect. This is exactly what I want to do. He began to explain to her that there would be a $200 deposit, and that as she got closer to the trip, she could pay the rest, but it was only March, and she had plenty of time. She pulled out wads of cash from her coat pocket and put the $200 deposit down that day, grabbed the brochure, and began to walk home, knowing that this Christmas, that little lamb would be a gift to Jesus. She had collected all of the money by the end of the summer, picked up a couple extra shifts even though her doctor insisted that she not, and one Friday she finally decided that it wouldn't be bad luck anymore to tell somebody about her upcoming trip. She waited for her regulars to come in and sit at the table they always did. She had their water and their silverware ready to go that Friday afternoon. When all of a sudden she realized they had slipped in the door and there weren't 2 but 3 sitting at the table. This little redhead sitting with the regulars, Mary Ann. She knew everything about this family, knowing that Mary Ann had been in school and was in college and back. She began to talk to them and say wonderful things about all she knew about Mary Ann blushing at the table as she sat with her parents. When all of a sudden Annabelle said, "How is school?" Mary Ann's head shrunk to the table. She didn't know what had happened or what she had said wrong, so she quickly changed the subject and asked if they would have the regular. That's when the father lifted up his head and said, "I don't mind telling you that I lost my job last month, and Mary Ann won't be able to return to school because we don't have the money for tuition." Annabelle said, "I'm sorry to hear so," and went back to place their order. As she placed their order, all of a sudden she heard a voice. "You can give him the gift now." She didn't know exactly where this voice was coming from, but she remembered as a child her mother telling her that Jesus can speak to you if you only listen. You can give him the gift now. After her shift ended, she went home. She sat around her table, hearing the voice again and again and again, before she realized what God was asking her to do. She pulled out her typewriter, wrote a note to Mary Ann, and said, "Mary Ann, there are too many children in the world who need teachers like you. Take this gift and go back to school, a friend." She signed the envelope and sent it in the mail, knowing that day when Mary Ann opened her mail, she would find $1,800, enough to go back to school for that semester. Annabelle was discouraged and frustrated, except for at the end of the day, she felt like she had lived her Holy Land adventure right then and there. She quickly walked to the travel agency to meet Mr. Olson to tell him, unfortunately, some business things had come up and she would be unable to go to the Holy Land this year, knowing that she wouldn't be able to save the money in several months. He told her that he would have to check, but perhaps, just perhaps, her deposit would be good for the next year. And she went home, sat down, and began scratching out her budget as quickly as she could. The next year came, and by the 4th of July, she had over the amount of money that she needed to go on the Holy Land tour. It was the 4th of July picnic at the pastor's house. And as she sat there, she finally decided to tell her pastor that she was going to go to the Holy Land that Christmas. He looked at her and was so excited and said, "That's always been a dream of mine. I hope you have a wonderful time." And that's when it happened. As she pulled the newspaper to wrap the glassware in her picnic basket, she saw a familiar face. "Tom? Is that really Tom?" You see, on the front page of the newspaper was a friendly face that she remembered from college. Tom and her had dated, possibly the only love and true love of her life. Dating for only 3 months in college, it was only after she told him that she had a heart defect that Tom decided he didn't want to be in a relationship with her. This time, she saw Tom standing on the cover of a newspaper with a woman that, quite frankly, didn't look as good as she did, and 2 kids. She continued to read the article to find out that Tom's wife had a horrible kidney disease and was in need of a transplant. And the family was asking for $50,000 to cover the expenses that insurance wouldn't cover. As she began to pack her basket, she began to yell, "No, no, no," inside of her head, knowing what was coming. And when she stopped to watch the fireworks that evening, she heard the voice. Give him the gift now. Frustrated, demoralized by this experience, thinking the man that broke her heart would now be another reason she wouldn't go to the Holy Land, she stumbled home, pulled out that old typewriter, and said, "You have a beautiful family, and I know this isn't 50,000, but I hope it's enough, and I hope enough people read your story and decide to help you out as well. A friend." The year came and went, and after meeting with Mr. Olson, she was reminded that her deposit probably was no longer any good, and the trip had now gone up to $2,200. Annabelle's health was failing quickly. She no longer could wait tables and collect tips. She only made salads 3 days a week. But she began to save as quickly as she possibly could, putting money aside, knowing that this would be her last opportunity to go to Bethlehem to give the gift to the baby Jesus. She collected the money, and by October, she had it all in full. $2,400 ready to go. She packed the money tightly in an envelope, this time never putting a cent in the bank, but keeping it wrapped up in an old boot in her closet so she could count it every week. She put it inside the pocket of her coat, knowing that there was no way that a thief was going to steal it from her purse as she walked down to the travel agency to pay in full. As she walked to the travel agency, she saw the smoke and flames, a house burning on her way. She heard the sirens as they came screaming to arrive on the scene, an old man being pulled from the fire at the last minute, a car speeding up with a young man saying, "Let me in, it's my family, let me through." A beautiful woman, a small child, and an old man hugging right outside the heaping ashes as the roof collapsed. Tears began to stream down her face. She quietly walked up to the family, heard the voice say, "Give him the gift now," handed them the envelope, and disappeared back into the crowd. This time she just began to walk, not knowing what to do or where to go, knowing that her adventure in the Holy Land was no longer. She walked to Mr. Olson's office and said, "Unfortunately, yet again this year, I'm unable to go to the Holy Land." He said, "We understand. Maybe next year." She told him maybe Philadelphia would do. She had some family there. Tears still in her eyes, she returned home and poured herself a cup of tea. And the phone began to ring. All of a sudden, she picked up the phone and she said, "Hello?" Mr. Olson was on the other line and said, "Hey, we need your passport number." She said, "What do you need my passport number for?" "Well, you're going on the Holy Land tour. Your name's right here." She began to explain to him that she had just been in the office to let him know. He said, "No, let me tell you, Annabelle, your trip has been paid in full. We need your passport number." She quickly ran to her dresser drawer, pulled out her passport, gave him the passport number. She was so excited to go on her trip. She got off the phone and began to think about all the things that she needed to pack. She pulled out the bronze lamb. As she pulled it out and tried to figure out how she would pack this to take it to her Holy Land adventure tour, she decided she should wrap it in tissue paper. She pulled out a chair, knowing that the tissue paper was at the top of her cabinets. And as she reached up to pull out the piece of tissue paper, a strong pain ran through her left arm. She felt as though she was falling, as if the earth stood still. And then she felt herself beginning to rise above her kitchen, rise above the lamb. And simply she saw her mother's face, and she heard the voice again, "You have given him the greatest gift." You see, Annabelle never got to go on her adventure to the Holy Land tour. 3 years she strived to get there. And 3 times she had the opportunity to do what God calls us to do, to serve others in need, to bring peace, hope, joy, and love to other people. To acknowledge that this Advent season isn't just about waiting for the renewal of Christ in our life and waiting for Christ to arrive, but acknowledging the living God, the Creator, Christ, and Holy Spirit around us every day. Advent is a time to celebrate. Advent is a time to live sacrificially. And Advent is a time to give the greatest gifts we can to those who need it the most. Thanks be to God. Amen.